Just remember, no matter how much training you get, no matter how much education you get, you will never be God. The challenge of being a first-year medical student, I found, is to be comfortable with a stranger sitting in the exam room right before me. As a second-year medical student, I found that the challenge was learning to question that said stranger about their health. And as a third-year medical student, as I'm finding out this year, the challenge is now being comfortable with what answers I get back when I ask those questions. And that day, that statement that came out of the middle-aged woman that was sitting before me really left me in a whirlwind of thought. Long after the interview ended, I walked away thinking, what exactly did she mean by that statement? Certainly this woman had been through a lot. She had to suffer the reality of knowing that her husband had raped her daughter. She had to suffer the reality of knowing that both of her parents had recently died. And she had to suffer the reality of knowing that she no longer held her job in middle management, filed bankruptcy, and ultimately lost her home. She had been through a lot. And her psychiatrist, whom this statement was directed towards, certainly didn't make things better. Clearly, by that statement, she was describing somebody who had insulated himself with his intelligence so far removed from her predicament that he could not ever relate to her. At least that's how she perceived it. But as I thought more and more about what she said, and as her words percolated in my psyche and simmered in my subconscious, I realized that there was an unintended meaning behind these words. For the God that she was describing was one that was so far removed from people. But then when you look at God from the standpoint of the Hindu faith, that's not the same connotation or the same description you get. The God in the Hindu faith is one who seeks to intervene on mankind's behalf. He seeks and looks to see when the opportunity is right, and in an act of humility and in the exercise of humbling himself, he manifests before humankind as an ordinary human being. And it's this act of humility that I find parallels what we do in medicine. Because this journey that the Hindu God takes from his abode down to earth is a concept that all of us are familiar with. Long before it was known as a multi-million-dollar coveted jewel in James Cameron's line of titles featuring fuzzy blue aliens on an exotic planet, Avatar, or Avatar, as it's described in the Sanskrit vernacular, was the name that pinned this principle. And it's this idea that, again, the Hindu God comes on earth, humbling himself, journeying from his abode, transcending his abode to meet mankind in between. And as physicians, I find that we have the same task. We have to transcend our training, journey down and meet our patients with their complaints. No matter how trivial we might think them to be, we have to take them seriously. I remember in clinic once, my preceptor came to me and told me to see a patient who had presented that day with a complaint of a headache. I walked in the room. There before me sat a woman in her late 20s, early 30s, with a son and daughter who were tearing up the entire room, tossing toys to and fro, ripping pages out of the coloring books. She said, "I'm really embarrassed to bring my kids here, but just work with me here. I need you to use your imagination." I was like, "All right, ma'am, whatever's on your mind, I'm willing to work with you." She said, "All right, when my boyfriend and I bake brownies," wink, wink, wink. "When my boyfriend and I bake brownies, I get a headache." Now, it became crystal clear why my preceptor had such a big grin on his face when he gave me this patient's file. And when I looked at the patient's file closely, before headache was now a term, now I know what the meaning is, I didn't know at the time, postcoital. Postcoital headache. And so, again, learning to meet my patient halfway, I had to take her complaint seriously, so I ran with the metaphor. "Ma'am, how frequently do you bake brownies on a given week?" Well, I figure my boyfriend and I, we bake brownies about once or twice a day, every week. It's like, okay. Now, when you're baking brownies, do you use chains and whips and handcuffs. I was thinking maybe it was from trauma or something like that. Not judging. Carrie came with my police. Not judging. Remember, we're the first class. I'm judging. Here's my disclaimer. I will always remember the look on her face. She had her hands up. She's like, My boyfriend and I, we follow the standard recipe. And I just can't get that feeling. You know that wholesome feeling you get after you bake brownies? At this point, the metaphor had just gotten to my head. Ma'am, I've never baked brownies, figuratively, literally, in every sense of every meaning that falls in between this spectrum. I've never baked brownies. So, I still acknowledge what you're going through, and we're going to help you before you go home. And we'll take what you're saying seriously. And yes, she didn't go home with some magic therapy or a script, but at least she walked away with the solace of knowing that her suffering was acknowledged. We met her halfway, the preceptor and I, just like the avatar does in the Hindu faith, meeting patients halfway as an act of humility, journeying down from where our training, the knowledge that bestowed us, to taking their whatever complaint that they have seriously. Now, in doing so, there's another risk to take. And you can see this in the lives of the various avatars in Hinduism. And that is that when God himself comes and blends in with mankind, he has to mask his divinity. He can't go around showing everybody that I have all these powers and such. Otherwise, people would look at him strangely. And so it's often ironic. It's the most learned of the religious scholars who have difficulty identifying the divinity that's present before them and the individual before them. And as physicians, I find that it's often when we don't take those complaints seriously that we compromise our credibility in the eyes of our patients. And it just so happened, actually, I was on service once, and a woman had recently been admitted to the hospital. She was committed involuntarily. Her neighbors had reported that she had some odd, eccentric behavior, had reported to the police, and lo and behold, she was at the hospital. They started her on some medications, and once she was stabilized, we went in to speak to her as a treatment team, and she said that for her entire life, she had hormonal imbalances, which needed to be treated with a cream, a progesterone cream that she had at home. So it was a valid concern. We walked out, we consulted with the pharmacist, and he said that while the hospital does have progesterone on the formulary, it's not a topical cream. It's a vaginal suppository, which means it goes up the vagina. And so we, again, it was a valid concern, so we had to put the order in. And lo and behold, the next day, even before we could round on the patient was ready to round on us. She was fuming, she was walking up and down outside her room, and finally when her turn came, what proceeded was another 25-minute tirade of how we hadn't taken her care seriously. She had also refused some of her medications the day before. She had actually taken a step back on her treatment course. And finally, when the topic of the progesterone came up, she proceeded to tell us that nothing had been in her vagina for the last 10 years, and that we weren't going to change that with this vaginal suppository, and that to spite us, as though like flicking us off with her middle finger, she took that vaginal suppository and had smeared it all over her ass. And she used the same gesture, just like this, just to prove her point. Now, as you can imagine, here we are sitting in this room, and the words coming out of this woman's mouth, it's very difficult to believe that this is coming out. And like everyone here, we have to maintain our composure as best and as much as possible. Unfortunately, somebody let a smirk slip, and it happened to be the resident taking care of this particular patient. And just like a heat-seeking missile honed in on her target, she honed in on that smirk, and whatever fragment of therapeutic privilege that she had afforded to this resident quickly was incinerated in like a matter of seconds. And again, it was like on the tail end. And from that moment forward, I mean, again, there were other things that had led to this point, but she could not take this resident seriously. And when I look at that, I mean, I feel terrible for the resident. I felt terrible that this had to have been transpired. But I look back at this and I think to myself, this is the other end. On one hand, we're tasked with humbling ourselves before our patients. On the other hand, we still have to maintain that distinction, that professional distinction as the practitioners of taking their condition, their complaints seriously. And just like the Avtars in Hinduism, who have this delicate balance, we can see that when we strive to make that balance work for our careers moving forward, we can become the Doctor Divine.